what we teach you here is how to respond to questions, easily. While learning the history of the mass media, don't try to remember every date. Just try to remember the story. If you remember the story, then dates can come. That's the easiest way. If you just remember that the history of the mass media in Nigeria began with the print, and that the first newspaper was established by Reverend Henry Townsend, and it's called Iwe Iroyin. And then after that, several other newspapers started coming up, and most of them were by nationalists. Nationalists were people that came into the scene at that time. The early press, and I said the early press in any history, the early press in the history of mass media in any country refers to the first set of the press that came in. And I said it was dominated by nationalists newspapers then. You can remember the names of newspapers that came in then. We have the West African Pilot, the one I told you about, which has to do with Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. We have the West African Pilot, Africa Messenger, Lagos Weekly Record, the Lagos Standard, Lagos Times and Gold Coast Advertiser, Anglo-African. If you can remember these names, just when you are writing, history, remember these names. Then, if you want to check up their dates, fine. Anyone you check up, it could help you. But I can't keep giving you dates and names, and it will make it sound like history and difficult for you to remember. Remember the gist. And I said the history of mass media in Nigeria began with the print media, and then the floodgate was opened. It took a century. It took a century between the time the first newspaper in Nigeria was established to the time the first indigenous television station was established in Nigeria. And that was the first indigenous television station in Africa. And that was Western Nigeria Television in 1959. And I said, if you are looking at the Nigerian press history, especially the early times when the Nigerian press history started, if you are looking at that, you should do so with certain characteristics, by looking at certain characteristics, because what we tell you here will give you the secrets of how to easily answer questions when it has to do with Nigerian press history. Anything history is always difficult. People tend to feel that it is boring, difficult to remember, but what I'm saying is always take this approach. A little dates. Don't try to every step you remember, you want a date attached to it. No, don't do that. Just take it easy. Remember the story. And I've given you a story. And I said, if you want to look at the history of Nigerian press, and you want to understand the nature of the media landscape when the Nigerian press started, use certain characteristics to do that. Use certain characteristics to do that. And I said, look at it this way, that the newspapers mostly had publishers who were also editors. So the editors doubled as publishers, or you can say the publishers doubled as editors. Most of the newspapers had their owners also being the editors. The newspapers lacked aesthetics. They were not beautiful. Their interest was just to give information, pass across information. The newspapers were dominated by men. In fact, the press history then was dominated by men. You had fewer women, just like even today when it has to do with newspapers, but the broadcast media, of course, has a number of women. In terms of gender, the early press landscape in Nigeria then was dominated by men. Had nationalists then, mostly men. Nationalists then that own newspapers, men, the reporters, the editors. You had few women, probably penning one or two stories for some newspapers. Then I said there was fierce competition among the newspapers because they were struggling for audience at different levels. They wanted to champion the cause of independence, so they were trying to compete among themselves. Who, especially in the western part of the country, where you had the hub of the Nigerian press, that's where you had the hub. So people were struggling, trying to carry enough information, trying to carry exciting information to enlighten their publics and to get people to read their publications. And I said the papers then had pro-independence content. They were mostly owned by nationalists. So most of the contents were about independence, enlightening people on how to get independence. Of course, they also carried local stories about deaths, about births, announcements by the chiefs, and giving people information about what the colonial people were doing. But the basic thing is that they were mostly championing the cause of independence. And they said the newspapers then had fewer pages, fewer pages. For instance, Iwe the first one had 12 pages. A number of them just have, it's not like today we have papers that you see 90 pages, 80 pages, and all of that. No, they had fewer pages. And then I've said papers then had local content. They had local content, enough of them, deaths, births, marriages, and then of course they were mostly in black and white. They were black and white newspapers, because then even technology then didn't favor having color newspapers. So papers then were in black and white, and then as I've said that the media landscape then was dominated by activists. There were people that were into nationalist struggle, people like Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, Anthony Nahoro, Shivabafemi Awolowo. Of course, he practiced journalism then too. Then we have they also had local language newspapers in the media landscape. Then a number of them flooded the industry. Then local language newspapers. Of course, I mentioned Gaskia Taki Kwabo. I keep mentioning it in every lecture so that you will remember that this was the first Hausa language newspaper in Africa, completely Hausa language newspaper in Africa. Gaskia Taki Kwabo, and it was really serving the Hausa language readers in the north and other parts of the country. And then it was popular then for giving information about the Second World War. People were reading Gaskia Taki Kwabo and were getting enough information, detailed information about the Second World War. It was popular for that. So that's the picture of the media landscape. That's the picture of the media landscape in Nigeria in the early times when the media started evolving. In the early times, the picture was that of papers that had editors as publishers, papers that had nationalist struggles, papers that had pro-independence content, that is trying to agitate for independence, using it to enlighten the people, papers that try to enlighten the public. They try to enlighten the public. I said the first newspaper, Iwe was established by Henry Townsend because he was, apart from the fact that he was a missionary propagating the gospel, he wanted to build a literacy program for the Eba people so that by reading the newspaper, they will begin to get enlightened. And that way, other papers started coming in. And then I mentioned a few papers. I said, always remember that while learning the history of the press, while learning the history of the Nigerian press, don't bother yourself with attaching dates to the stories. First get the story and then the dates will come later. Then drag a few dates. Just drag a few dates in. I said, for newspapers, if you remember 1859, fine. You can also remember that Daily Times came up about 1925, 25, 26. Just remember that. Then get the story straight. Then I said, remember a few newspapers that you can use to color your story. Of course, if you're telling the history of the press, you should be mentioning, some newspapers that came in then. And I said newspapers like the West African Pilot. Of course, I told you, the Zik and Chain of, about that owned by Nnamdi Azikiwe. I said West African Pilot, African Messenger, Lagos Weekly Record, the Lagos Standard, Anglo-African, Lagos Times and Gold Advertiser, Lagos Times and Gold Coast Advertiser, Lagos Times and Gold Coast Advertiser. If you can remember these names, that way you will understand the nature of the evolution of the Nigerian press. The early times, the first few years of the especially the first phase of the history of Nigerian press. If you can remember these things, I said that'll be fine.